everybody. Thank you for viewing our first two videos of the series. I'm going to be introducing number 3 of the 6-part series. In this video, we're going to be discussing the species of the project and what those species are, where they exist in the river, how our project is going to support those species or how it may support those species. And we're also going to be discussing AFSAR itself, the Aboriginal Fund for Species at Risk, and some of the information regarding that project and how it supports species at risk in our community.
AFSAR is an acronym that refers to the Aboriginal Fund for Species at Risk. It's a program that targets financial resources for Indigenous communities to look at the species at risk in their communities. So again, we're looking at the 4 species at risk in the Grand River that runs right through our community. This is not our first species at risk project. There was one done, I believe, around 2009 that targeted the birds of 6 nations. And with that project, it resulted in a little bird book being developed, which we still currently have for sale here at Kayanase. Yeah, it's just a great little reference document that has a picture of the bird and just gives you some basic habitat information on the species. One of the main targets of the project was to develop educational materials and resources that would exist beyond the life of the project. So that's where we came up with, we've got 4 brochures developed on all of the species that are being targeted by this project. So those are great little information pamphlets that we can make available to the students throughout the project as well. And they'll become a legacy of the project. It's material that we can continue to use and make available to the community. As for it being an Indigenous-led initiative, that's really important because it's really, I think, one of the first times Kayanase's taken on a project like this where we are the lead for the project. We're the ones who are doing the outreach, trying to develop the partnerships and the collaboration and to connect to the youth to engage in this project. One of the things that Gerdo did earlier on in the project was last summer he connected with a local business, Mudcat Milling and Forestry Services, and they sponsored a fishing derby throughout last summer to help promote this project. And because of COVID, we've never really been able to actually sit down face to face and talk about their experiences with the project. So maybe down the road, Gerdo, you can maybe talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah.
And how their efforts have supported the project as well, and trying to engage the community and just doing that outreach to local fishermen and sharing the raising awareness with them about the species at risk in the river that they're fishing in. Yeah, I think that's really the big push behind this project, is for it to be a collaborative community event that we're engaging with but the title of the project alone, Youth Connect, is we really want to offer youth opportunities to engage back to land-based learning. Because over the last few years, when we started engaging in ecotourism, it's one of the things we hear the most often is people feel really disconnected from the land and they want those opportunities to learn. So unfortunately, because of COVID, we weren't able to have the in-person experiences that we were hoping to have with this project, but we're hoping that the webinar series can kind of convey that same enthusiasm and passion that we have for our work.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to section 3 of our series. This is looking at the forest ecology and ecological terms for our AFSAR project here in forest ecology of 6 nations. So right now we're on the Kayanase OSTTC site. We're in the interpretive meadow, and meadow habitats are sort of a mixture of shrubs and wildflowers and grasses, and they also have sometimes trees interspersed into them. But more often than not, they're open. It's sort of an open habitat. So that's what we have here. We do have some larger trees, and we're in the riparian zone of the Grand River. So the riparian zone is a term that we use that refers to an area that's identified by a community of plants that's associated with the shoreline. And so those include herbaceous plants, flowering plants, as well as trees and shrubs. So this is the black walnut, and this is commonly found in the riparian zone. It is a member of the Carolinian forest, so it's a member of that southern forest type that's associated with southern Ontario, 6 Nations, places that are generally south of Toronto. And like I said, it's common in riparian zones. So we are sort of on the fringe of the riparian zone of the Grand River here. We are in the flat section where there is the potential for flooding. And like I mentioned, this is a meadow, so it's sort of open. We have open canopy above us where these grasses and flowering plants can grow. And it's sort of representative, a good place to look at succession. So succession is our other term we're gonna mention here. And so succession is what happens when there's a disturbance on the landscape, and the first things that go to colonize that soil after there's a disturbance is referred to as succession. And so you have your rapidly flowering and spreading species, and then you have gradual introduction of other species that grow a little slower. They have a little bit different life cycle, and as it matures, you get a taller or higher canopy of species, and you get into bigger, more long-lived trees over time until you have what's referred to as a forest or a mature forest or an advanced stage forest. So this is a place where we can look at succession in its early stages. So I'm going to walk in this direction here, and we're going to look at some of the flowers that are growing here. Obviously it's winter, so the flowers aren't blooming right now, and everything is sort of just gone to seed, gone dormant. So the one that we have here is evening primrose. And so evening primrose is a wildflower that's native to our area, and it likes to hang out in these types of meadows and prairies, which is the other open type habitat that we have here in 6 Nations. It has nice, beautiful yellow flowers. So this whole stem will be covered in a cluster of yellow flowers, and it's attracting all sorts of pollinating insects like bees and butterflies and hummingbirds, things like that. And so we have these species that are sort of indicators that tell us that which part of succession that we're in. So it is sort of a colonial species. It does move in very early into areas, and it'll stay in that area for a while and sort of self-propagate itself into edges and meadows and open areas. So often you'll see it like in ditches, along the edge of your property, like where your mowed grass is, and it transitions to tall grass or tall weeds. That's where you'll see this growing commonly, and it's very common in 6 Nations. So it's a native species we can learn about. And then we have another one here. This is our I believe this is our sweet oxeye, or one of our. sunflower species. We have a number of species in the sunflower family, and also gone dormant. Again, a species with nice bright yellow flowers. Grows fairly tall, 4 to 5 feet tall, and often you'll see the butterflies landing on it. And it's a native species that's important to our area. So a lot of these plants we have flagged because they're actually indicating where our native flowers and species are growing, that where we're going to gather seed from or monitor these areas throughout the growing season. So these are all common in our meadows here and in our grasslands. And if we sort of move a little further, we see a bunch of other plants here. And again, it's hard to I guess sort of talk about in the winter because you can't really see the flower in bloom. But these are our native asters. New England aster, I believe, is the species, and it is a native species as well. So very common in Six Nations, and it's part of the meadow habitat. And so as we move closer to this edge here, we have a change in the height and the change in succession. So this part to my left here has sort of not been browsed or mowed or had any sort of disturbance. So you have a transition of the plant community into more of a woody shrub community. So what we have is staghorn sumac, which is one of our most common colonizing native species, where it colonizes areas of soil and it spreads through the roots, and it provides a very sort of dense habitat for things like rabbits and deer and birds. And then like right here, we have another black walnut, which itself as a tree is something that is sort of a colonizing species. One of the first trees to move into areas. Often it's spread by squirrels that are burying the walnuts in the soil, and so it spreads that way. Also, just because it produces so many walnuts that it'll spread, and a lot faster than some of the other types of trees. So commonly you'll find this growing on edges as well, and in open meadow type habitats. Like I said, in riparian zones near rivers is very common. And where we have this transition happening, we also have the raspberries, the black raspberries growing, which is another woody stemmed shrub. And so we have that change from more herbaceous flowering plants and grasses. And then we have an edge or a transition where it's a little more mature, hasn't had any mowing or any sort of disturbance. And so it's allowed to mature into more of a woody stemmed community of shrubs. And so raspberry is one of those ones. In Six Nations, the black raspberry is very common. That's what we have here. This is the black raspberry. And it also seems to have a sort of a relationship with the black walnut. So very commonly you'll find the black raspberry growing underneath the canopy of the walnut. I'm not exactly sure why that is, but it's very, very common to find that. Anywhere the walnut is growing, there's a high chance you'll find the black raspberry growing there. And so these are important places to recognize and understand these terminologies. So the first thing I talked about was the riparian zone, and those are habitats that are associated to or with the river and its shoreline. And the further back you go from the river, the community of plants sort of changes, and you sort of move out of that riparian zone into a different type of habitat. So we do see on the fringe the black walnut being one of those species that you see growing in river bottoms or associated with river flats, nice rich soils, places where it's going to have that sort of flat land to grow on as well. And then the closer you get towards the river, then you see more of those species associated with the riparian zone. And then I talked about the other terminology, which is succession. And so in this meadow, the succession goes from the flowering plants we just looked at and some of the grasses going into some of the more woody shrubs like the staghorn sumac here in front of me, the black raspberry, and then going into more of a mature stand of young trees that we see behind me. And like I said, the black walnut commonly will occupy that habitat as a fast-growing, fast-spreading tree. And these are all native species, very common to our area, and places where we can go and learn and engage with these and understand what their role is. And one of the important, very important roles of these plants in these zones is the relationship between the animals and insects and the way that they utilize this as a habitat. So the staghorn sumac is actually a food source for rabbits in the winter. So you see these rabbit tracks here. There's also other signs, like we have rabbit, take my glove right off here. We have rabbit droppings. And so that's another sign of this habitat being utilized by native species, our native cottontail rabbit. We also have indications that the rabbits are feeding on this. So it's a winter food source. As the snow, this hard packed snow covers the ground, the rabbits can't really access anything that's growing or green or fresh, so they will eat the bark of this and a number of other woody species as a source of energy. And when I was growing up here, I was told that the rabbit droppings here are actually a source of medicine. And because what they're eating is all medicine. They're eating the bark of these woody shrubs. So red osier dogwood, willow, raspberry, and these sumacs are all medicines. And so when they're eating these, they're actually processing the medicine into their meat. And so when we eat the meat, it's I guess it's considered medicinal. And also these droppings, I was told when I was growing up, were used as a medicine. They're actually steeped in hot water and used as a fever medicine for children. Now, I never took this medicine myself growing up, but I always heard that. Another way I've heard people use it is actually as a smudge. So they I guess they burn the droppings, and the smoke that it produces is, I guess, has a medicinal effect on you as well. And I've actually done that myself, and I'm not sure what the why, but it makes you feel really calm. I'm not sure why. Maybe it's just in my head, but that's one thing I learned and have tried. So all these things are connected, and you see where the rabbits have nipped off. When it's a rabbit and it's on an angle, it's a very sharp angle. That's how you know it's a rabbit, because they have very sharp incisor teeth. If it's a deer that's been browsing on it, it'll be it's very shredded and a messy. It's not a clean cut. That's how you know it's been a deer chewing on it. And these stems are actually an important habitat for our native bees. So the honeybee, which we all know and love, is actually a European species. And our native bees are generally solitary. They usually live alone, not really in colonies or hives. And they will burrow into this stem, and they will lay their eggs into that stem, and they'll overwinter in the stem. And so when the spring comes, those eggs will emerge, and that'll be our pollinating insects for the next coming season. So even though we're not like in the river and we're not in the water, and we're not even talking about the species at risk that we're trying to support, when we plant and when we allow space for this naturalized habitat, we're actually promoting biodiversity, and we're protecting the river itself, because what this does is it filters water, rainwater, and it filters all of the anything that's coming off of the land, whether it's a herbicide or pesticide or a chemical nutrient that we're using in our farms. These natural zones will help to filter that out before it gets to the river. That's the role of the riparian zone, is to help to filter all of that before it hits the river, and to provide habitat and all these interactions that are related to the river itself. And so this is how it's all connected. And when we talk about our culture, when we give thanks, we start with the earth, and we acknowledge the earth, and then we talk about the flowering plants and the grasses, and then we talk about these woody shrubs, and we talk about the trees. So even when we give thanks, the way we do it is we start in a way that reflects the natural succession of habitat. So eventually this will turn into, if left alone, it will mature into a forest someday. And that's how the cycle continues. And our ancestors would maintain this meadow habitat by burning it periodically to maintain the grassland for their purposes, whether it was for gathering medicine or gathering berries or gathering other plants that they used for making things like fish nets and things like that. So this is the meadow habitat. Okay, Scanos Luego. This is Gerdo again. This is our webinar number 3, and we're talking a bit about AFSAR, Aboriginal Fund for Species at Risk, and we're talking a little bit about species involved with the project, but we're also just trying to get a more of a discussion and narrative on species at risk in general. And so I have a guest speaker here, Lauren, and I'll let her introduce herself and who she works for and a little bit of her background.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So my name is Lauren Jones. I work with Six Nations of the Grand River, the Wildlife and Stewardship Office. I'm the assistant manager there. I myself am not a Six Nations member. My family actually comes from Garden River, so Anishinaabe. Most of my job has to do with the accommodation team, the CAP team. So it involves a lot of reading over EA documents and official plans and things like that, in which SAR is, or species at risk, is considered one of the things that these proponents have to kind of look at and have to make accommodations for. And it's basically my job to push them to go past what the legislation forces them to do and to actually try a little bit harder. Or at least that's what I have decided, at least.
Right. So you mentioned EAs. Yes. And environmental assessments. And can you just outline roughly what that entails, like sort of the background information behind EAs and how they sort of tie into species at risk work type stuff?
Yeah, so I mean, it is very dependent on the project that you're looking at. There is obviously, for very big projects, there's going to be a very, very intense EA process. So they're going to be looking at pretty much everything and doing all of the surveys, trying to characterize everything and really covering their bases. Whereas if it's maybe a project that is, say, just replacing a road that's already there, or putting up a new streetlight where there already is a streetlight, there's not going to be as many restrictions there. So it does very much depend on what the project is. Regardless, it's our role as Indigenous people to try and take care of the environment as to our standards and not necessarily what the settler standard is. And yeah, it is very dependent.
Yeah, so it's like a piece of legislation that was passed for proponents who are trying to build roads or subdivisions or pipelines, these sorts of large projects, but all the way down, like you said, to smaller projects as well. They have sort of accommodations they have to make for species at risk, right? And so that's kind of what you do. You're reviewing their applications and things like that. Is that kind of what you do?
Yes, it's a lot of that, yeah. And personally, what I find with a lot of proponents, not all of them, granted, some of them are very good, but they tend to just take it to what the legislation requires of them, and they don't try to necessarily actually proactively try and prevent impacts to these species. There's certain recovery plans and management plans that the government puts out that you can kind of use as your guidance materials of okay, well, yes, it's special concern, doesn't necessarily qualify for any of these protected zones that you might want to see for a snapping turtle or something, and you can try and push for that regardless.
Awesome. So the Species at Risk Act is a piece of legislation that they sort of categorize different levels, right, of
yes.
risk that a species may be experiencing, and so that's sort of what proponents or companies that are trying to do work, when they're applying to do that work to a municipality or something of that, these places, what is it, like county, municipalities, and cities, right? Places where they're proposing to do their work. They're required to make accommodations sometimes for species, depending on the risk level, depending on the presence or absence of that species. So sometimes they have to pay for the work to happen beforehand. So like an example would be like a natural heritage survey, right? As part of the planning process. So for municipalities and cities and towns where work is happening, they oftentimes are required to do, actually, I think all the time, they're required to do an environmental assessment. And part of that is if there's natural areas or waterways, especially, they have to produce a baseline of information or data about the species present, right? And this is what we're sort of referring to, just to give some general background, break it down a little bit.
Yes.
Because some of the people watching, they may have no idea, right? So.
You're right. Yeah. I mean, ideally, you want them to go like really, really try really hard and, really characterize everything. Unfortunately, because it costs money to do these things, right? And there's nothing necessarily in the legislation that says how much effort they have to put in. They just have to prove one way or the other. Yeah. So you're absolutely right. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So, so some of the work that's carried out as far as if, for example, it's a natural heritage survey and there is a water course or a stream or a river or creek, something like that, they identify the type of waterway it is, right? Even if it's a wetland or the type of habitat it is. From that, they can determine what species may be present based on population distributions of some of the species, right? And some of those distributions may be, for example, the ones on our list here, we have black red horse, for example. And so the red horse is that group of fish. Some of them are intolerant or they don't tolerate a lot of, sedimentation or poor water quality. And so their populations tend to decline, especially in, parts of the Grand River. So that sort of, if it's work happening in the water, then that proponent, that project or that company will need to determine, the potential impact their work is going to have on that habitat, that environment, and that species, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So, are you familiar with the different levels of or categories of risk? So, like you mentioned, special concern. Can you get into that a little bit?
Yeah, for sure. So it is important to note that there's different scopes, I guess. So there's the IUCN list, the red list, which is a global list of what's considered endangered, what's threatened, what's least concern or not listed. And then Canada has a list as well, which is COSAWIC. So that, and they all vary a little bit from each other. For example, in the Ontario list, if something is not a concern, they just don't list it. Whereas if you go to maybe the global list, then they'll identify it as least concern. So generally it will go from least concern or unlisted up until maybe special concern. So that's something that, we're keeping an eye on it. And then threatened, which is basically if nothing is done, then it is likely to become endangered. Endangered obviously means what it is. There's not very many of them left. You got to really look into it. And then again, in the global list, it'll go up to critically endangered, which is kind of dependent on the species itself. Critically endangered for, a white rhino is going to be completely different than critically endangered than for a red-side dace or something. Right. And then there's extinct or extirpated, which obviously means that they're no longer found.
Right. Yeah, and to break that down further, extinct would be the species no longer exists or is not known to be existing or living in the wild. Extirpated may mean it doesn't live, for example, in the Grand River anymore, but it may exist in other places in Ontario or United States, North America, right?
Exactly. And those extirpated species In my experience, at least, those are very interesting species in terms of people are very interested in those species to see if there's possibility to reintroduce those species in the future, which is always very interesting because you obviously don't want to do that if those conditions are still present that cause that animal to go extinct in the first place. So that there's this whole stepwise situation to get there.
Right. Okay. That's good. That kind of broke that down, and that's really what I wanted to do, is kind of break that down and as best as we could.
There's tons of visuals out there that could explain it much better than me.
Yeah, for sure. There is. And we can provide, visuals, more visuals. We actually have a D2L page where we're uploading the videos onto and material for the
Very
youth
cool.
to access. Yeah, and just to give more background to the project we're working on. So it is an AFSAR project, which is the Aboriginal Fund for Species at Risk. And that application was 2019. And so the species that were sort of being the focus of attention for that application were the black-red horse, silver shiner, eastern sand darter, and the brown pigtoe. So 3 fish, one mussel species.
Yeah.
And so the project we applied to was, I guess what we were trying to accomplish is just to provide a little bit of habitat restoration at Chiefwood Park. And the idea is to address the issue of shoreline degradation and sedimentation that's happening there, or erosion, sorry, and how we can engage with the land and sort of use methods that are very simple, very effective to maybe not stop erosion, but at least provide habitat and maybe reduce a little bit of the erosion. So last May we installed some coconut coir cloth to the bottom meter of the shoreline there by the boat launch at Chiefwood Park, and we used some live staking willows. Sandbar willow was the species we used, and that was just the original idea before the pandemic hit, because it was before the pandemic, right? It was to have the students or the youth out there with us, talking about the hands-on aspect and doing the actual work to get that experience. And so that was the core of our application, and it got approved by AFSAR, which is the Aboriginal Fund for Species at Risk. And so are you guys familiar with AFSAR? Have you done any work with them yet, or?
As far as I know, we did apply for a grant this year. Because AFSAR isn't just aquatic species, correct? Like it's all species at risk. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So as far as I know, my boss did apply for a project regarding insectivorous birds on reserve. I don't know if we got the funding for it yet, though.
Oh yeah, awesome.
Have you checked on the rest? Sorry, I'm changing subjects real quickly. Have you checked on the restoration? How's it going?
Yeah, so So not only did we do the coir cloth and the live stakes, we actually planted in the fall some native species, some shrubs and some native sedges and grasses and wildflowers up on the upper portion of the shoreline. The stakes, they probably had maybe, just from what I've observed, close to like a 30% survival, which then we put in like over 300, I think, somewhere around 200 to 300 stakes. So not the best, but there was some take. And they were in some of the more exposed shorelines that they were actually growing in. And the cloth itself is still there. It is decomposing.
As you would expect, though.
Yeah, right?
Right?
What we want. But and then there's a lot of invasive it's just covering of species. And one of the main ones is one of the mustard species, and there's also Japanese hops growing there. Yeah, so it's super thick. Just kind of, we've done past plantings there, and it just chokes it out every time. So we did do an application of herbicide in 2020, just to sort of knock it back. And but yeah, it's just it's in rough shape. Part of the shoreline.
Every little bit helps, though. Like, I think that's the important takeaway here, is that if everybody did this, like, our world would be so much better, right? If everybody kind of made that effort.
Yes, exactly. And that part of the shoreline, like when I was a kid growing up in the 90s, it was stable. Right up until about 2016, you could really see the erosion happening. So, and then I've seen pictures from the 1980s and 70s, and that shoreline was unchanged, for all those decades. And then right up until last decade, it's really just eroded, and there's been like metric tons of shoreline just washed away from the flooding and the freeze thaw happening in the winter, because we don't have the continual ice cover through the winter. And so you have rain happening in the winter. There's no cover crop of plants or vegetation, and so it's just been sloughing off really significantly. And the ice cover that protects the shoreline is not reliable like it used to be. So it's had its ups and downs. Since 2016 seemed to be the year that it really, and that really sort of coincides with like the warmest winters we had on record, started in like 2016, right? So I mean, I don't have any data to back it up. That's just my observation,
I mean, like, it's not an out there observation either, right? Like,
because they used to mow the grass right almost to the shoreline previously, and since that we've seen this change in our winter pattern a little bit. It's they can't mow it anymore. It's just this whole washing away. And so anyway, just to provide some shade, some vegetation, some native vegetation, we're hoping is going to just be a little part of habitat that's going to benefit all these species.
For sure.
Yeah, that's kind
of.
And
maybe it's not a bad thing that they can't mow right up to the edge anymore, too. You know what I mean? Like, that's not very ecologically sound. What you need is as much riparian vegetation as you can get.
Yeah, and that's kind of the goal too, is to bring that to light. So we weren't managing it well in the first place, and so it was not resistant to climate change because it was being mowed, right? And so what we have is a massive loss of shoreline and sedimentation of the river, which degrades the habitat for all these species. And so if we can at least put something there that's going to provide habitat, provide a little bit of protection, it's better than doing nothing, right? And if we can inform some of our youth of the community and give them the hands-on skills, that's kind of the goal of the project. And it got approved, so
congratulations.
That's right when the pandemic hit too. We got our approval. So the in-person stuff we want to do just hasn't happened. The good thing is that we had only planned to engage 8 to 10 students or youth, but now we have, I believe, close to 60 signed up for the virtual platform that we're doing right now on our recording.
I mean, that's fantastic. I mean, and we've definitely, I think that COVID has definitely caused everyone to be a lot more creative when it comes to public outreach and education. And things are opening up, so we're sort of hoping that we may be able to do before the end of the month something in person for anyone who's interested, just to do some more additional work on the shoreline, whether it's life stakes or anything like that, or even just seeding, like hand sowing seeds and just having people out there. And we did have some local volunteers from local companies in the community who came out and offered help when we did do the life staking. That's wonderful.
Community engagement was a major part of it, and traditional knowledge, we've shared some of that as well in our previous video. And so anyway, in a nutshell, that's our AFSAR application.
I love hearing this stuff.
And project, and so, like, the AFSAR fund is geared towards engaging the First Nations communities and in being active, playing an active role under species at risk, whether it's habitat restoration, whether it's gathering data, whether it's connecting the community to traditional knowledge, historical knowledge about species and our interactions with the land. And so I just wanted to you mentioned your aerial insectivores and getting more into field surveys and the role those play in species at risk. Do you have anything you want to add or share about natural heritage surveys or any field activity that you've worked on? Or
I mean, I'm very much looking forward to field season and actually getting out. In terms of myself completing field surveys, unfortunately, I've been pretty woe is me when it comes to that. A lot of my previous positions have been either in zoological facilities where I'm just doing public outreach type activities, or I'm the paper pusher, the documenter, the writer.
Yeah.
So yeah, unfortunately, a little bit lacking on that, which is why I'm kind of looking forward to this year so much with Six Nations, because I can actually get out there and do stuff.
Yes.
But yeah, what was
no, it's all important. Even the reporting and the marketing, all that is key, and it's actually my what I struggle with. Even for this project was the marketing. I needed a lot of help. Even with the brochures, I gathered the general information, but someone else did the groundwork on the brochures and whatnot. So
I mean, some people are just naturally good at that.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and it's nice to be able to just put in someone's hands and they just take care of it. And my brain is outside. I
can appreciate that.
Yeah. No, that's really good. So as far as you mentioned aerial insectivores and the application that you have done, does that entail bats or birds?
I don't think this one will. For bats, for birds, yes, that's the main priority. One thing that we did have a biological inventory on birds on reserve occur a couple years ago. So I think, as far as I know, at least, the intent is to try and update that information, especially since, as we were discussing before, the different assignments of certain species being special concern, threatened, endangered, all that. So there is some species that were assessed back then that weren't considered SAR, but now are. So they weren't really afforded that much focus back then, but now we kind of want to focus more on them. We want to try and figure out what they're doing on the reserve and how they're doing here. So the intent is, as far as I know, at least, to kind of update that information and see what we can do with it at that point.
Yeah, and there is very little information about species on the reserve. Yeah. As you may already know.
Yes.
It's been recorded and it's available to for research or even for documentation.
Yeah.
And that bird project in particular you're referring to, I believe it happened back in 2007, 2008, somewhere around that time period.
It's been a few years for sure.
Yeah, and so the data needs to be updated, regularly in order to have a good picture of what the species are doing, what their status is, whether they're still in a healthy state and on the land there. And I know some of the people who were involved. I've worked with them in the past, and it's been a struggle. When I was growing up here, and as a kid growing up and as a youth in high school, early 2000s, there really wasn't a whole lot happening for the environment in the community. And even up until now, I was at a conference with the GRCA, the Grand River Conservation Authority, And they sort of had this big blank spot on their maps for their forest information, all their species surveys. There's a big blank spot, and it's right where Six Nations is.
Yeah.
Because the data just doesn't exist. There's been no studies done here, right? And the GRCA I believe, is a provincial entity, so they don't have access or jurisdiction on the reserve, which is federal land. And so the data that exists for the species here, what's happening with our ecology in the community doesn't really exist anywhere, other than the few things that have happened. There was one, I believe, winter bird survey done back in sometime in the 90s, the late 90s, I think.
Citizen science strikes again.
Yeah.
Saves the day.
And, so it's outdated information. You have to have staff like yourself employed in the community now to be able to, organize these types of things. And even on our end here at Kayanase, to be able to apply for these funds and get some data, or even just get some habitat established, is major.
Well, I mean, we're really happy for you guys. Like I've like, because we get because again, part of my job is to talk to these proponents, right? And they're trying to accommodate our wishes in some cases, at least. And a lot of the times I just make the suggestion to like source their seeds from Kayanase and source their materials from Kayanase. So I'm really happy to have you guys on reserve too.
Yeah. Yeah, it's been growing, and it's taking a couple of decades to get to get information and get established and get our foot in the door as far as restoration, and I guess just as a Indigenous community or Oglahoma community, to refer back to our own language and how we refer to ourselves. It's always behind what the rest of the province or the rest of Canada is doing, and to have to sort of face that down and try to work in that environment, and with those lack of resources has been a challenge over the past decade or more that I've been in and out of school and my work background and whatnot. And so for ASLR to grant us this has been, major for us. And unfortunately with the pandemic, like I said, we've had to shift and reimagine our whole plan a little bit and take this approach of doing things remotely and, as much as possible. And I don't know, is there anything else you wanted to just share or talk about, like experience or like your educational background?
Sorry.
Before we start recording, you mentioned you did some lab stuff.
Oh yeah. Well, when I was in university, so I actually got what was it called? An NSERC because of my Indigenous status, which was wonderful. Like, so that's just another example of why grants can change lives. Mm-hmm. But I was, I worked in a fish lab. It was a molecular fish lab. So we looked explicitly at, I guess how hormones in the water systems, how that affects fish and their ability to live and reproduce, which is very interesting.
Yeah. Huh. Oh, that's really cool. Yeah. No, that's a whole.
That's a whole thing.
That's a whole thing. Yeah. Yeah. No, that definitely impacts like sort of our project. The way I sort of wanted to approach it is because these species that we're looking at, the black-red horse, the silver shiner, the eastern sand darter, being what they are, they're sort of the base of the food chain for, or they're at the lower trophic level of the food chain for the bigger fish. You mentioned sustenance fish that we use for our own food, right? So right around this time of year is where we're going out and spearing walleye,
Yeah.
And that's a major predatory species, and so how we talk about these things in the water that enter through pharmaceuticals or sewage, and even pollutants that enter the water, they tend to magnify up the food chain, right? And we have this biomagnification
Bioaccumulation is what I was told.
Bioaccumulation, magnification, yeah. And so these small species of fish are at the bottom, that lower trophic level. They're feeding on microorganisms and planktonic organisms, and they're accumulating toxins, right? And then we have these larger predatory fish which are feeding on those, and they're actually increasing the concentrations of some of these things in our environment. And when we eat those, it increases even more in our own bodies, And so that's one thing that's good to bring up and talk about. In relation to our project, because these are, bait fish in our that we're sort of trying to support. And so having that awareness of how that bioaccumulation works, how it's studied, and how it does, impact us and the fish in the environment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And how much more research into it still needs to happen, right? Because there's still so many knowledge gaps, and it's why it just needs to continue to be studied, and we need more people on it.
Yeah, for sure. And even for you can sort of order or access the fish eating guide, Ontario Fish Eating Guide, online for free. And they're only basing their information on, I believe, mercury and PCB. So they're not even looking at hormonal interactions.
Well, I know from experience that it's somewhat hard to assess, so I can see why.
Yeah.
But yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and other pharmaceuticals in the environment, and it's kind
just
of
a whole
overwhelming.
Bunch.
Yeah. But at the same time, exercising our treaty rights to gather, resources and to gather fish. It all ties it back into how we interact with the land and how we can support habitat, Yeah. So that's really good that you bring these things up, because it triggers the discussion. So would you say that as you review, some of these things and from proponents, how significant in our area would you say that the impact of species at risk are on these projects and their accommodations, or anything that they have to look at? Because we're in a very populated area.
Yes. Yes. Because some proponents are very good and they are very accommodating, and they do really take Indigenous rights and interests very seriously, and they do try to listen to us, and they do what we ask, right? So some of them are fantastic. Other ones, not so much. Like I said, there's a few that really just scrape the bottom of the barrel in terms of what is required of them of legislation, and they do the very bare minimum. Which again, sorry, you might hear my dog drinking water in the background. That's very distracting. I would say that because Southern Ontario is so developed, it is definitely having a huge impact on species at risk, because there's nowhere for them to go, right? And for certain species, there's obviously more impact than others. For something like amphibians or turtles, they can't move that easily. So whenever there is impacts to wetlands, especially, we get very protective of those. Even the really charismatic megafauna that maybe isn't here anymore, right? When was the last time you saw a caribou on Six Nations?
Yeah.
Hey buddy, I'm busy. I would say development is a huge issue, both for habitat loss and fragmentation. It's always a thing that we're concerned about. It's always a thing that we're trying to mitigate as much as possible. And I really like that there's so many different techniques that are coming out to try and kind of assist with that. So they have artificial nesting boxes for birds and bats now, which you never really would have thought that would be a thing. I've read of artificial hibernation pods for some species of snakes that I think is just so cool. and this is what I'm talking about the going above and beyond. So maybe yes, keep the tree where the bat is, but if you absolutely can't, how about you build it a new house by making it a bat box? It's one of the things that we're trying to encourage, I guess.
Yeah, no, it's awesome. Yeah, because that leads me into, I guess, the other part of the discussion, because you bring up some really good points about, proponents and so the actual carrying out of surveys. These proponents will go and they'll hire consultants to carry out the work. Oftentimes, sometimes they have in-house staff who interpret the reports that they get from consultants, things like that. But a lot of the footwork, the field work, is carried out by consultant companies. So proponents say they want to build a road, or a municipality needs to extend the road, or support some energy project. What they do is they'll have to do the natural heritage survey and make accommodations. But to help them do that, they'll hire a consultant who has all the information and knowledge. They have the mapping skills, right? They have all the experts in-house who can do the surveys and determine the data that's required for them to push the project forward, right? And so sort of just to touch on things like education and employability for anyone who's interested in entering that field. What's your sort of take on that? Your education or your career experience? Anything you want to add to that? And I want you to share.
Luckily, I do find that people are taking things like Indigenous knowledge more into concern now. So like, even if you don't have any formal education, if you get out there and you volunteer and you get the experience that you need to make yourself marketable, who knows, you might not even need any sort of formal piece of education, depending, right? However, it will probably be easier if there is some sort of formal education attached to it. I myself have an undergraduate degree in biology, but there's also environmental sciences that you could get into, geology, geography. I also have an undergraduate certificate in environmental restoration, which is in Niagara College. Very good program. I mean, it really just depends on like what you want to get into, right? Like, I can't really say I ever envisioned myself being a wildlife and stewardship management assistant, mostly because who has that job title? But in terms of like being an ecologist, I kind of always knew that an undergraduate degree was going to likely be necessary. So that's what kind of I aimed for. But who knows, right? It kind of depends on what exactly you want to get into. But I'd say if you're trying to figure it out, or if you're not sure, then get out there, get volunteering. Tons of people need and want volunteers, and you can kind of pay yourself by getting that experience and make you more marketable in the long run.
Yes. Yeah, that's a really good point. That's kind of what we're aiming for with this project.
This is all just a really long advertisement for both of our projects.
Yeah, because we're really hoping to, by the end of the month, just to be able to get out and do something on the ground at the site with, anyone who's viewing this. If you want to be involved, we're going to have the information out there for you to be able to come out and to see it. But also just to like you said, for them to be able to go on their own and even just to visit the site. Right now it's under a flood watch, so maybe you wouldn't go there today, but yeah, you may have connection disruption. Oh, you're back.
Yes. Okay, I lost you too. Yeah. Is that me or is that you? Okay.
Oh, I'm not sure.
Sorry.
No worries. What was I saying? Oh, I was just talking about just for people who, like you mentioned, want to volunteer. We are going to have hopefully some volunteer work to get hands-on experience, but also if on their own they want to go and check out the Chiefswood shoreline near the boat launch at any time and sort of see what we've been working on. I encourage that because it is a part of the community. It is a public access point. That's why we wanted to do the work there. And you can engage with Chiefswood Park itself. This was another video we worked on with Chiefswood Park. So they talk about everything they offer, some of the history of the park itself. You can go there and rent boats. You can rent the cabins there and camp out there and whatnot. They have community pricing for members, you know. So that. I want people to be able to go on land and engage, you know,
Yeah.
actively with it. Yeah. And then as far as like the education, you know, level, taking it all the way to the degree and university realm. I went the college realm, the like
Yeah.
the hands-on,
Which is just as valuable though, right? Like I ended up going to college afterwards anyway to get that experience. So
yeah. Yeah, no, there's you know, it's completely up to the individual, you know, to gain that experience and to gain that level of education that they want to attain, right? And to make that work for them, right? That's a journey that you kind of take on, and no, it's good to hear different perspectives on that, and especially from you know, other to hear from another, you know, First Nations perspective, and even you know, coming from different communities, you know, to bring your own community perspective is really valuable for our youth to hear, because it's different for everybody, you know, and even the time, you know, the time of that we're in now. Like I said, when I was growing up, there was really nothing, wasn't a whole lot, you know. You know, there was some work happening here and there, but even as far as the internet and the internet access and videos and apps that you can use now for identifying species and learning, and changed a lot. I don't know, you got anything to contribute to that? Like,
I was just thinking that, because I was just thinking, like, even if somebody doesn't necessarily want to go into like the biological, ecological fields that we're talking about, like, it's still, I think it's still very valid to kind of do what you can in your own little bubble, right? Like to plant those native species in your garden, to you know, log on to iNaturalist, because anybody can download that app and and just identify the things around you. I just think that's so cool. Like the idea that the average person can instantly identify a McDonald's sign 2 blocks away, but they don't know what a dogwood looks like. It's kind of crazy when you think about it, right? Because there was a time in our history where like that's crazy, like that you wouldn't know that. But yeah, so like even if you're not into like even if you don't want to pursue this career path, like there's still tons of resources out there to just learn about the world around you, and I think that's just as valid.
Yes, exactly. That's perfect. Like what you just said there, because like people have asked me in the past, you know, how do we engage, or how do we, you know, contribute to, you know, the environment, and part of it is just learning the species that are around you, and learning the native species and the local ecotypes and things like that. Even the McDonald's reference you made, it's really good, because like,
was that too sassy?
No, it's perfect, because I use that exact example because you know, when we talk about our own culture and our own traditions, we use symbolism. Yeah. You know, and one symbol contains a host of information that that we can preserve, and that's how our ancestors actually passed on information, is with a lot of symbolism, right? And so the McDonald's, the arches, they, you know, if you were to write that information down on on pages, it would be a few pages on just like the menu, like how you order, how you use the drive-through, right? But we know all that instantly when we see it, right? Yeah. And we use the same thing in our culture to signify large quantities of information, and you know, to recall all of that instantly. And so that's being applied to projects like this, where we want to use symbols of these species to sort of talk about restoration, talk about you know, species at risk, or even the level, you know, trophic levels, all these terms that we're talking about. We can use these symbols of these species and just to help us to learn. Yeah. Another, you know, way to think of it is like we have the Five Nations belt as an emblem of the Haudenosaunee people. So it's got the 4 squares, and it's got the triangle in the middle, right? And that whole story takes about 8 to 10 days to tell. But when we see that, when we're raised in the community and we're told this story throughout our lifetime, when we see that symbol of that wampum belt, that tells the whole story. Just when we look at it, all that information is encoded in there. And so when you use that McDonald's reference, I use the exact same reference when I talk about encoding information
Yeah.
for non-literate, historical cultures. This is how we pass information on, right? And this is funny that you said that exact same reference that I use all the time.
Well, I mean, not quite.
Yeah. No, that's really good. So I don't know if there's anything else you wanna mention or talk about.
I mean, this is your show, really. So.
No, that's really good. I'm glad you're able to join us and share your perspective, and I think we can sort of wrap it up and well, I'd like to say thank you, Nyama, for joining us and contributing and bringing your voice to our project. I really appreciate it. Especially
for having me.
Yeah, and it's short notice, right? Like I said, I'm really bad with the email.
You're not that bad.
Outdoor stuff, yeah.
You're good.
Yeah, that's all. I think we can cram into our little session here. And is there anything you want to share about, like the wildlife office? Any information or if contact or anything like that?
Yeah, sure. So we do have a Facebook page. It's the Six Nations Wildlife and Stewardship Office. You can follow and and just like interact with us. Both my boss and I are relatively new to the role. So I think we're still very much trying to get our footing and let the community know that we're here for them. I think they're very used to having Paul General, who was lovely and he's awesome and he helps us out all the time, thankfully. But I think we do have a little bit of an issue with visibility of like, hey, we're here now. So yeah, I'd follow us on Facebook and, feel free to reach out. I love talking about this stuff with people. So
yeah. Community involvement is the most important thing for our organizations. And I work with Bethany. She's the manager there in last spring, and we did surveys for gypsy moth, and as a community member I was able to get her access to properties of my family members where they have big woodlots and get into the bush there and identify the trees and get an idea of what the impact of the egg masses were going to be for a forest. And that resulted in some spray activity happening and pushing down those gypsy moths, a little bit longer before they can get a real
trying our best.
Yeah, because that's a major impact on our forests here, and some of the youth on the call, they may not remember, but 1998, 99 in our community, the trees were totally bare from the gypsy moths, and it was summertime, and it was really crazy to see that that impact they had on our forests and the lasting impact that had, because some of the trees, a lot of them died out after that. They were not able to recover from that stress. And so being a community member and being involved, volunteering, everything we've talked about, understanding species at risk, and like you said, you can go and find this information online as well, and educating ourselves and informing ourselves on all this is well, I'm really glad you brought it up, because I think it's been brought up yet by in our other recordings. So it was really good to have you on and offer your voice to us. So I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. This was so much fun.